Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here with you in Mexico at the Mexico Health Summit. My name is Alba Tiley, and as the speaker before me said, I work on the Sustainable Antibiotics program at DSM Sinochem Pharmaceuticals. We are a generic manufacturer of pharmaceuticals with a specialization in antibiotics. The topic I'd like to talk to you about today is antimicrobial resistance, AMR for short. AMR is a phenomenon that happens when the antibiotics that we have become resistant to the drugs, or rather to the bacteria that they are meant to kill. Now, it sounds a bit like a benign problem, but I ask you to come with me into a time machine, say 200 years back. If we think back to a time 200 years ago when antibiotics were not yet discovered, very, very common and small diseases that today are very easily cured could be dangerous or even lethal. So if we think of strep throat, for example, or a child's scraped knee, things today that don't worry us at all were very dangerous or potentially lethal. Today, antibiotics are the cornerstone of our modern medicine. We count on them to do surgeries successfully, and also chemotherapy for cancer treatments is also very much dependent on antibiotics for a successful outcome. Yet somehow, we still don't manage to value these antibiotics. The former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon a couple of years ago said that AMR was one of the growing and biggest health threats to global public health of all time. That in addition to the impact it'll have on food production and international global development. In 2014, then Prime Minister David Cameron, sorry, we can go to the slide. Thank you. Then Prime Minister David Cameron, he commissioned the biggest study yet on the future impact, potentially, of AMR. And that's where this big fact comes up behind me. So according to the study, what is now 700,000 deaths annually due to AMR could balloon into 10 million people dying every year by 2050. Now that's one person every 3 seconds. The cost to the world economy could be upwards of $100 trillion, and that's in lost days of work and increased strain on our already overburdened medical system. To me, AMR is really an issue that compares only to climate change in terms of how big its scope can be. So AMR is a naturally occurring phenomenon in nature. We build resistance, bacteria builds resistance over time. However, the scary thing that we're doing here as humans is that we're accelerating that resistance by misusing and overusing antibiotics, both in human applications as well as in animal health. So some concrete examples of this happening. Many doctors prescribe antibiotics for viral infections, such as the cold or the flu. In the United States, 2 out of 3 prescriptions for antibiotics are actually useless when given. In terms of animals, for fish farming and animal raising, many farmers are using antibiotics for growth promotion or for preventative purposes when animals aren't even sick. But the reality is that our animal food production system is very much reliant on these precious antibiotics. Sir Alexander Fleming in 1928 was the discoverer of penicillin, the first antibiotic. And he said upon winning the Nobel Prize, he said, "The man who thoughtlessly uses penicillin is morally responsible for the death of the man who dies of an infection that is penicillin resistant." So he was a very prescient man. But what we discovered is that it's not only through animals and through humans that bacteria spreads, it's also through the environment, through soil, air, and water. What we discovered about 4 or 5 years ago as a company is that actually our industry is contributing to AMR as well. The industry is contributing because the process of making antibiotics requires an awful lot of water. And after the water is used, it is cycled back into nature. Now, if that water is not properly treated and filtered, then you risk putting antimicrobially active waste into the environment. It ends up in reservoirs and bodies of water, as you see here. Now, what that means is you end up having bodies of water that have bacteria that can be resistant not just to one form of antibiotic, but perhaps multiple different types of antibiotics if there are many different factories nearby. If we go to the next slide. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about our company and why this is so important to us. We can go back to 1869. We're a company that has its roots in the Netherlands, in a small town of Delft with beautifully engineered small canals. And we really see ourselves as stewards of these very valuable products and have a history and, I guess, an ethos of trying to produce sustainably when it comes to water and the environment around us. Well, today we have 2,000 employees worldwide in China, India, in Europe, and also right here in Mexico. In 2011, we became a joint venture of two companies, a Dutch company and a Chinese company. Now, I'd like to share a little bit with you about how we differ in how we treat our antibiotics and our wastewater. A little bit about our position and what we believe in. So we're looking for the highest possible standards and transparency. We use the best available technology when we're making the antibiotics to make sure that we're not causing any AMR. We operate dedicated wastewater treatment plants, and we use antimicrobial activity testing to make sure that the water that we're emitting back into nature does not propagate further AMR. Now, of course, we're not the only company doing this, and we're working within the framework of many different allies. We're part of the AMR Industry Alliance, which is a group of over 100 different companies active in the space of antibiotics. Some of them are actually among us here today, like the woman representing Pfizer. But in terms of generics, which is the market that we as DSP represent, there are only 6 generics companies part of the alliance. And now that's a really scary thought because actually most antibiotics today are made by generic companies. So, where are they and why are they not at the table with us? I think the answer is quite simple. The truth is we operate in a business environment where margins are very short, competition is fierce, and the people who are buying our products, the buyers and procurers on behalf of countries and large organizations, they have a lot of pressure on their budgets too, and are looking for the cheapest possible drugs. And in this context, in this perfect storm, if you will, it appears that some companies may be willing to cut corners in order to achieve the prices, the low prices that are needed of them. But I think that we all know that when you start to pay a cheap price for something, someone, somewhere, whether it's in a country far away or maybe it's the environment, someone is paying the balance of that price. And I think it's important that we realize that today, because if AMR really does become as serious as it's slated to become, that cost will be borne by our health and the health of those around us. Yeah. So, are there solutions and how do we clean up our act? So there are 3 things that I think could be potential solutions when working together. So higher standards and improved transparency, this is a must. We need to get more producers on board and buyers recognizing why this is important. Next, why don't we look at the regulations that do exist. So in the pharmaceutical industry, we're working in a highly regulated environment. So there are frameworks already at work. Why don't we look at where we could, in those different frameworks, plug in sustainability and AMR? So for example, could we think of including environmental angles into the guidelines for good manufacturing practices, or GMP, which is currently mostly focused on quality? Next, how could we create an environment where we can consider sustainability criteria in the buying decisions of buyers of drugs? So right now, when a buyer is purchasing antibiotics, they're looking mostly at two things. The first one being, of course, the price, and the second being the quality of the product. Now, what if they would also include environmental sustainability? So there is one country in the world right now who is doing that, and that's Sweden. Sweden is looking at environmental and social sustainability angles when they procure pharmaceuticals in their public procurement. Now, a few months back in the Netherlands, there was a documentary released on specifically the topic of antibiotic pollution in production. There was a huge public outcry, and for the first time, people started to really realize the severity of the issue. So what we did is we worked together with civil society organizations. We got together other pharmaceutical companies, NGOs, insurance companies, all kinds of different actors at the table. And we sat together to try to see if we could, as a multi-stakeholder group, come up with an agenda that we could work on together to actually once and for all make sure that sustainability is included in public procurement. It's actually gone quite well. And in the last few weeks, the government and the main insurance companies have met in order to come up with such an agenda to take it forward. The Netherlands has a system where the 5 largest insurance companies are responsible for the bulk of procurement for the country. Now, pharmacists and hospitals also participate in procurement, and of course, every country is different. But I feel like if we could export this model and this will to collaborate, then I think we could have a lot of success. Now, that brings me to Mexico. Go to the next slide. So Mexico is really a powerhouse in pharmaceuticals in its own right. Here in Mexico, there's a big problem with overuse of antibiotics. Although many steps have been taken in the recent past to try to bring that down to a manageable level, still AMR is an issue and overuse is prevalent. Now, at the same time, Mexico is the second largest pharmaceutical market in the region and is one of the top 15 markets globally. Add to that there are, of course, increasing healthcare costs here and a rising life expectancy, so more costs can be expected. Mexico could be a very great place to try a similar project and see how many stakeholders, as we heard earlier today, both the public realm and the private sector, how all the various stakeholders could work together to improve the standards and improve procurement of antibiotics in Mexico. So I hope I've successfully laid out for you today how important AMR is, and if it continues on the path that we're going right now, that it becomes a huge and serious risk to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and it touches on a variety of different topics from health to economic development to environmental sustainability. We need to make sure that we get the environmental angle under control once and for all. And finally, we need leadership, not just on a national level, but on a regional level, and also on a global level. So we really need international collaboration on a problem that is essentially borderless. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, then I'm happy to take them.
Hello, good afternoon. My question is, what initiatives can pharmaceutical companies implement to minimize their impact on this problem?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What initiatives can pharmaceutical companies implement to minimize their impact on this problem?
Yes, definitely. So what companies can do is properly treat their waste. So by companies having on-site the treatment facilities where the water can be run through to make sure that it's not being expelled into nature with still that antimicrobially active waste. And then on top of that, regularly monitoring that to make sure that the levels of antimicrobially active waste do not rise.
Hi, Alba. Thank you for your speaking, great speaking. And is there any special works that DSM Sinochem are doing in Mexico to fight against the microbial resistance?
Yeah, definitely. So in Mexico, as in all sites around the world, we invest in that technology to make sure that all of our facilities are working in the best possible way and not contributing to AMR. So on the one hand, of course, in Mexico, we're doing that. But we're also doing as much advocacy and awareness raising as we can. So we're working with embassies, with other companies, with this platform here, working with the government to try to raise awareness and try to together try to tackle this problem.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Jose Alarcón, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Just wanted to get your feedback on how big is this problem. You mentioned Mexico has important challenges. How can you measure it? In what type of measures? And how do we compare to other countries? Are we in the lowest or the highest?
So in terms of the issue of overuse and misuse of antibiotics, Mexico is fairly high up there. My understanding is that up until a short time ago, prescriptions were not necessary for antibiotics. Now they are, but still they're prescribed very liberally. And not necessarily specific to Mexico, but a lot of research shows that many doctors feel pressured to give antibiotics when someone is in their office or their children are sick. So they end up giving antibiotics when they're not necessarily necessary. So I think Mexico does definitely have severe challenges, but as do many other countries in North America and in Latin America, certainly.
Muchas gracias. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, very interesting. So I wonder about the role of the phage therapy. I mean, is this something that we can expect to see in the near future, or we still need to stick to conventional antibiotics, so to speak?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. What about not just inventing new antibiotics or new substitutes to antibiotics? Wouldn't that be a solution to the problem? And I think what we do see is that there are some companies active in new antibiotics or new types of therapies. However, for those to get to scale takes such a long time that what we advocate for is being good stewards of the materials we already have. So we have antibiotics that do work, and if we don't accelerate the problem further, we can keep these longer. So I think it's a double-sided approach. I think on the one hand, we do need to look at new solutions. On the other hand, we just need to be conservative and properly use what we do have available.
You finish early. Here.